It's the Sony XB43. It's a speaker that I wasn't that kind about on my first overview video, and as is often the case, the longer you spend with a speaker, the more you get to know it, the more you get to know its strengths, no matter how small those strengths may be. The fact is, I have this speaker. If I didn't have this speaker, I'd have to pay £200 for it, and that would be a different matter. But the fact that I do have it, and I compare it to other speakers that I've been using, especially smaller speakers, one thing I do appreciate about this speaker is it is a bigger sound. It does have the mid-bass slam. It does have a bit too much mid-bass slam for me without enough depth. But once you get over that, what it does offer is, a reasonably decent sound. It's quite a safe sound, but it's not. It does lack those mids. What I'm saying is, the fact that I do have it, I have used it a bit more than I thought I might use it, simply because it's a decent sound stage. Although I can pick holes in it, and I wouldn't want to go out and spend £200 afresh. The fact that I've got it, I am making use of it, and it does have a place. Want to compare it to other speakers that I've got that you've been asking about, and that I think are comparable. Obviously, the main one being the JBL Xtreme 2. I'm throwing in the Dockin D Fine Mark II. It's a speaker that nobody really seems to be very excited about, except me. This is a speaker I'm playing a lot. I really like this speaker. As with a lot of speakers, it's not perfect. There's a lot wrong with it. But overall, its strengths, for me, I find it a very enjoyable listen. It offers me a lot that I'm not getting from other speakers. So I'm sticking it in here because it's a 50-watt speaker. It's in the same bracket. And of course, the Dockin D8. I'll put you down, mate, for a minute. This is the budget boombox. This is 70 quid, 50-watt speaker. £180 50-watt speaker. £200, we don't know, because Sony don't tell you what the watts are. I'm assuming from my testing, it's probably about 40 watts. It's probably safe to say it's around 40 watts. And then we got the £250, still £250 extreme price of the JBL Xtreme 2. So how do they compare? Well, we already know that has a really nice rumbly bass. I've already mentioned I particularly like the mids on the Dockin. Talking about, this is quite a thin sound with a big mid-bass slam, so it does have a slam. Talking about it being a nice beach or party speaker, and we know this goes blinking loud for the price of 70 quid. So there's a spread of prices, but these are all big speakers. I would also have to say, in terms of it's a big speaker, the biggest of the lot is the 3 kilos of the XB43. That is the heaviest of the lot, followed by the 2.5 kilos of both the JBL Xtreme 2 and the Dockin D8. So by far this, is significantly the heaviest. Coming in as the little kid on the block, the Dockin D Fine, 2.2 kilos. So it's actually smaller and lighter than the other 3 speakers. In terms of battery capacity, I should mention it's quite important. I do only get 2 hours at maximum volume, or 2 hours 14 minutes maximum volume, 4 hours 4 minutes for the Xtreme 2, 2 hours 20 minutes for the XB43. That's not great, is it? And 4 hours 12 minutes in default mode for the D8. But of course, 66% probably more real world use. I do then get 9 hours 44 minutes from my Dockin D Fine. I'm getting 7 hours 40 minutes from the Xtreme 2. 5 hours 44 from the Sony, and I haven't tested that at 66% yet. Thing to mention about the Sony though is it has a low volume mode. You hit 5 hours 44 minutes at 66%, but then it go on reducing the volume gradually, and you can actually get over, I got over 21 hours in total as a listen, whereas the others, they play at that volume until they pack up. You probably also want to know about especially YouTube latency. The Sony XB43 is the best of the bunch, and I have to say, as with most of my JBL speakers, not very good in terms of latency. 250 milliseconds is really poor for a YouTube latency test. They do all have tweeters. I will say, given the £250 price of the JBL Xtreme 2, it's pretty much disgusting, quite honestly, that you still only have SBC basic codec. Would you expect in the budget boombox, Dockin D8, but not a 250 quid. Whereas the Dockin D Fine, we got aptX, and of course we got LDAC for the Sony, which is obviously their proprietary codec system. and of course AAC. Bluetooth, they're all Bluetooth 5 except for the JBL Xtreme, still the old man on the block, but we know there's the new JBL Xtreme 3 coming out, which I believe is mono, but it's still supporting 4.2 Bluetooth. They all have wireless stereo pairing. Only the Sony and the W King are USB-C, but that does mean we have proprietary chargers on the Dockin and the JBL Xtreme 2, and that means they'll charge faster. We got a 19-volt charger and a 15-volt charger. So as nice as USB-C is, remember, when you've got proprietary, it's going to charge faster. Also worth mentioning the Dockin, the W King, only IPX5, whereas IPX7 on the JBL, the Sony, which means drop it in water. These are splash proof. These are drop in water up to 1 meter for 30 minutes proof. Amazingly, in this day and age, they all have an auxiliary input. I don't know how much longer we're going to get auxiliary inputs. All of these speakers do. Now I'm going to get on with the test. Sony has grown on me, but this is a speaker I use a lot. The JBL Xtreme just doesn't suit, especially indoors, my kind of listening, because it goes impressively deep, but it's overwhelmingly bass heavy for me. And the W King, for me, just lacks the finesse of a more expensive speaker. So I'm particularly interested in this shootout. Going to start at 40%, but of course when I say 40%, the main speaker that I'm testing will be the 40%. So that's the Sony XB43, and then I'm matching volumes on the others. In this particular case, it does mean, well, I'm still at 40% on the Xtreme 2, I'm still at 40% on the Dockin, but with its weird volume scale, it does mean I'm at 13% on the W King D8. It does start from quite a high volume comparatively. So 40%, 13%, watch out, I do put in my clips what the recorded volume was. I'm recording it at those volumes because that's the closest match they are in the real world, and then I normalize it just to get it as close as possible in terms of comparative perceived loudness. So 40%. Sony XB43, Xtreme 2, Dockin D Fine, and the way too bass heavy King D8, when they're all normalized to the same perceived loudness levels. Although it's massively bass heavy, the King D8 still doesn't have the biggest bass peak. That is the Sony XB43 -11.9, which is well ahead of the JBL Xtreme 2, and the JBL Xtreme 2 is in line with Dockin D Fine. In terms of the shape of the bass, they're quite similar. The Dockin D Fine just a little bit thinner than the Xtreme 2, and also about as thin as the XB43. It's the bigger bass on the Xtreme 2, just doesn't go as deep in terms of the actual bass peak for the Xtreme 2 compared to the XB43. So you don't need me to tell you that sounds incredibly muffled. It does have a very heavy bass compensation over bass compensation at these lower volumes, and so in actual LUFS, I'm normalizing via a LUFS, so in proper perceived calculated terms, all you're hearing is that bass, and in real life at low volume, it does come over as pretty muffled. I would say, you know, the XB43 doing quite well. The Xtreme 2 to my ears sounds a bit dull at these lower volumes, and the Dockin, as I said, is a speaker I like. Maybe I'm alone in that, but it does have particularly strong upper mids. It's strong along all the mids, but particularly 2 kilohertz to 6 kilohertz. So upper mids, presence region. It is stronger than the others. It gives it some clarity. There is a dip around 2 kilohertz, but that prominent mids does make up for it. So those are low volumes. I mean, you're probably turning the volume right up, and you're going to hear it a lot louder than it would be in real life. In real life, 40% is quite a low volume. For me, probably 70% is not something I would listen less than that. Certainly with the Sony XB43, and therefore 70% on the Sony XB43, which means 63% on the Dockin, 60% on the Xtreme 2, and a bit better now, 49% on the D8.
myself permission to see sitting in this prison. I'm wondering why I've been put in this position. Someone check my pulse, I'm not in the best condition. But maybe now I can really start to listen and use this transition and fuel my ambition. And maybe now I can give myself permission to see sitting in this prison. I'm wondering why I've been put in this position. Someone check my pulse, I'm not in the best condition. But maybe now I can really start to listen and use this transition and fuel my ambition. And maybe now
69% for the XB43, and all the other speakers normalized to the same volume. We still have the Dockin D8 sounding very, very muffled. It's still way, way, way too bass heavy. And even though it's bass heavy, although it does have the biggest bass peak, minus 10.9, that's bigger than all the others, its deep bass isn't far ahead. Minus 24 is actually behind the Dockin D Fine, well behind the Xtreme 2, which has the biggest deep bass. And then the Sony XB43 again, minus 24. So we're just looking at the bass. The Xtreme 2 does dig deeper and is more rounded. The Dockin D Fine doesn't quite have the mid-bass slam of the XB43, but minus 24, minus 23.5. The Dockin D Fine actually has a little bit more in the deep bass than the XB43. So, yeah, clearly still the Dockin D8, even at these volumes, it's not until you get above 50% it comes into its own. Still a bit muffled in these comparisons when we're comparing same volumes. The XB43 does have a nice mid-bass punch, but you're aware that it doesn't have the lower bass slam that we are now getting from the Xtreme 2. These volumes, Xtreme 2, plays to its strength, which is a low bass rumble that you can feel. It does have the nicest low bass, but we have the mid-bass push boost on the XB43, which is going to translate into slam. The Dockin, to me, much more balanced. It does have dips where you don't want, but it does have the forward mids again, as I said. So to me, it's more balanced. There is bass, but when it compared to this 2, it doesn't have the low bass of the Xtreme 2, and it doesn't have the mid bass, which is overboosted on the XB43. Now, you will still see there is a mismatch in volumes. So something that's maybe a bit fairer to all of them will be 93% on the Sony XB43, which then means the Dockin is at 83%, the Xtreme 2 80%, and a more reasonable 76% on the D8.
Let's take it slow. Where you go, I go too. And if you hit the bottom, I'm going down with you. Let's take it slow. Who cares where we gotta be? You know you'll have a good time wherever you're with me. Let's take it slow. Ask me how we got here, 'cause you don't know how. You say we're taking on water, yeah, we're sinking now. You're looking all concerned, like we're gonna drown. But we both know how to swim, no worries as we'll fall now. Let's take it slow. Where you go, I go too. And if you hit the bottom, I'm going down with you. Let's take it slow. Who cares where we gotta be? You know you'll have a good time wherever you're looking all concerned, like we're gonna drown. But we both know how to swim, no worries as we'll fall now. Let's take, you're looking all concerned, like we're gonna drown. But we both know how to swim, no worries as we'll fall now. Let's take, you're looking all concerned, like we're gonna drown. But we both know how to swim, no worries as we'll fall now. Let's take, you're looking all concerned, like we're gonna drown. But we both know how to swim, no worries as we'll fall now. Let's take.
Real world volumes now. We're really pushing the Sony XB43, which is playing at 93%. In terms of who goes the deepest, the JBL Xtreme 2, minus 23.5, well ahead of the Sony XB43 now, which is all mid-bass, compared to the JBL Xtreme, which is minus 23.5, 4 decibels up in the deep bass. The Dockin D Fine is also up on the XB43, but behind the Xtreme 2. And the W King D8, at least now, sounding more balanced. It does have the biggest bass peak at 71 Hz at minus 18. It's well ahead of the others. In terms of deep bass, minus 24. It's still behind the Xtreme 2. It does have a big bass on the budget W King D8. So the W King D8 is doing what you're paying for. You're paying budget prices at 70 quid for a 50 watt boombox. Does it deliver in the bass? Absolutely, but just lacks finesse. The subtleness that you get with, by paying a little bit more. But what you do get is satisfying bass. For a lot of people, that is enough. The XB43, now we're at 93%. The bass is coming off a little bit, so the Dockin is now catching up in terms of the bass peak on the XB43, but still can't match that lower bass on the Xtreme 2. And in terms of vocals, it's going to sound a bit drier, but you are seeing the strengths come through. It's only it's playing with a bit more deep bass than the XB43 is at these volumes. As you start pushing to party levels, not earth shattering. Probably these are levels you will probably end up playing if you buy speakers like this. What's coming through to me is the Sony XB43 is a safe speaker. If any speaker can be a safe speaker at £200, but when you think it wasn't that long ago, I reviewed the B&O A1. That was 200 quid. And they are, well, I know one's a little speaker and one's a huge speaker, but in terms of what can £200 do, it's pretty safe. It's most people, you're not going to say, oh, that's terrible. Still for me, the Dockin, it is a little bit more balanced because that's a lower bass boost, that's a mid bass boost, and that has great weight, but to me, it's more balanced. And by the way, I should say, because it's going to be relevant now, because I'm going to go on to the maximum volume. You've got 3 modes on the Dockin. You can go to a bass boost mode. You can make it sound more like an Xtreme 2 type sound by going to bass boost mode. It's also got a clear mode where it will cut bass a little bit, give you more battery life. Xtreme 2 doesn't have any other modes. The XB43 allows you to stick in some EQ modes, and there is the EQ mode in the W King. At lower, I don't bother using it at lower volumes, because what it actually does, it makes it sound like you've got more bass because it goes louder, but actually you've got a bit less in the mids. It's not until you actually want maximum volume that the EQ mode really comes into its own, because it's adding a couple of decibels. But look, I know people, you switch it on and suddenly, it's a bit louder. It's got more bass because it's going louder, but it's not really changing the sound in a better way. You're not getting free bass, if that's what you're thinking. So using all these extra modes at maximum volume, let's have a listen.
Come around, forget your mistakes, then you come back with the bottle. Come around, forget your mistakes, then you come back with the bottle. Forget your mistakes, then you come back with the bottle. Around, forget your mistakes, then you come back with the bottle. Come around, forget your mistakes, then you come back with the bottle. Forget your mistakes, then you come back with the bottle. Forget your mistakes, then you come back with the bottle.
In absolute terms, the W King D8 in EQ mode is by far the loudest, minus 10.8. That's 4 decibels in perceived loudness terms, louder than the Sony XB43 in EQ mode. So there's a huge difference. However, It's heavily distorted, it's a bit shrill, it's a bit painful on the ears, but it does go loud. The Dockin D8 in EQ mode, the budget boombox out of this group of speakers, goes the loudest. How much bass does it retain? In terms of bass slam, the bass peak 80Hz minus 22.5 is the loudest of the bunch. It has the biggest bass peak, as well as going absolutely the loudest. However, in terms of the deepest bass, 50Hz, 60Hz, lower bass, minus 36, minus 38, the Sony XB43 in EQ mode has a bigger 60Hz peak. That minus 36 is the same as the Dockin D8 in its default mode anyway. It's just that the deep bass and the bass peak is louder. It's a long way behind the Xtreme 2, behind the XB43 even in its default mode, and the Dockin D Fine is the loudest of them all in terms of that deep bass. Minus 27, minus 36 in bass on mode, and even in default mode, minus 28, minus 37, minus 28 is 8 decibels up on the Dockin D8. The other thing to note is all that extra noise that you're getting when you push that Dockin D8, even if it's default mode, it has the most noise. The Xtreme 2 pretty clean, so is the XB43 in comparison. Only the Dockin D Fine, when it's got its bass mode, has that increase in some distorted bass, and again, much cleaner in its default mode. So Dockin D8, the loudest, EQ mode XB43, second in, D8 default just behind. And then we've got the Xtreme 2 beating the XB43 in its default mode, beating it for absolute perceived loudness, minus 15.6 LUFS, 16 on the XB43. It's not huge, but it is louder. Now, RMS 19.3, minus 19.5, again, almost the same, but it is louder on the Xtreme 2. In terms of the bass, that mid-bass peak, again, is louder on the XB43. It does have a big mid-bass slam, minus 27, minus 28.8. That's nearly 2 dB louder mid-bass, but deep bass, minus 31, minus 33, 2 dB up for the Xtreme 2, minus 40, again 2 dB up on the 50. So deep bass, the Xtreme 2 does win out. Quite honestly, the Dockin D Fine 2 is the winner in terms of deep bass. It may not be going as loud overall, but minus 27, minus 36, or minus 28, minus 37, even against the Xtreme, minus 31.40, minus 28, 30, minus 37, is significantly going louder and deeper on the Dockin D Fine than the JBL Xtreme 2, but it's just not as loud overall as the other speakers. So, depending on what you're after, overall loudness, mid-bass punch or deep bass rumble, a different speaker will be your pick here. So I did push the Sony XB43 bass to maximum because it's a maximum test. 10.6.2, I mean, I could have pushed it even more in the mids and the highs, but the 6 and the 2 is pretty much my go-to settings, and the bass to taste. It was quite interesting because one thing that comes over is it's not just about which one is going loudest, because there's no competition. The EQ mode on the D8 by far the loudest, but it's also the hardest to listen to. I mean, it's heavily distorted and it's very shrill sounding. It is reasonably clean without the EQ mode, and it's still loud. It's only the XB43 is technically louder when it's in custom EQ mode. But even then, you can argue actually the D8 maybe slightly cleaner. It is at plus 10 on the bass with the Sony XB43. It's not the cleanest sound ever, but it's certainly a lot cleaner than D8 in EQ mode. But the point being about, well, it's not about the loudest, because the one that retains the most bass is actually the Dockin D Fine, which in terms of absolute loudness is actually the quietest. Although it's not a huge difference. They will go quite loud, but the Dockin by the least. But it's significantly more bass heavy. In terms of 50 Hz deep bass, I mean, it's 2 decibels louder in the actual deep bass than the D8 in its EQ mode. 6 decibels than the XB42 in its default mode. I mean, even in its default mode and not bass mode, it's only 1 decibel behind. So the Dockin really does retain the most bass as you go to the top volumes. But because the mids and the highs aren't going as loud, it's in overall perceived terms, because in perceived loudness, bass counts for the least in terms of weighting. It doesn't come out as the loudest, but maybe to you the most satisfying listen. Again, probably the safest sound is the XB43, even at loud. Maybe the Xtreme 2 is cutting bass as good as it was at lower volumes. By the time you get to these volumes, although deep bass 2 decibels louder at both the 50 and the 60 Hz mark, so it does have a bit more deep bass. But I think the XB43 just holds on to a bit more sparkle, makes it a bit more of a listen, but there's not that much in it between them all, other than the Dockin D Fine. So I seem to be the only one thinking the D Fine as one of the contenders out there for, you know, for a go-to speaker. Certainly one of the speakers I'm going to the most. XB43 is, for me, a bit clinical sounding, but it's safe. To be honest, it does have a big soundstage. So I have been picking it up more on that basis, just knowing that I'm going to get a bigger sound. The Xtreme 2 has never been... It can be, you know, the high end can get a bit harsh as you push it. For me, it's just too much overblown in the bass, but for a lot of people, that's going to be great. And don't forget, I've been doing these tests, and most of my listening now is indoors. If you're going outdoors, it's a whole different story, because what's overblown indoors probably sounds just about right outdoors. You've got to remember, bass is boosted indoors. All your walls, all your surfaces increase significantly the amount of bass you're actually hearing. That's why you need a bass boost once you go outside. So bear that in mind. What sounds boosted indoors, or what sounds balanced indoors, could sound bass light outdoors. There's going to be a difference depending on the kind of room you're listening, just how near the wall it is, or is it out in the middle of the room, and what kind of reflective surfaces you have, what kind of furniture. It's all going to add up to making a difference for you when you're choosing a speaker. So that's my roundup. You'll take what you want. Clearly fantastic value, even if it's not the greatest sounding speaker. If all you want is something to go boom, 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 that's great value, the D8. I still think it's got the most finesse. To me, it's the most hi-fi sounding, the Dockin D Fine. And yes, it has dips where you don't want dips. And yes, the vocals are a bit dry, and it could be a bit more forward. You can knock holes in it. But it's a very warm sounding. I like the weight to the bass that actually goes up to the it's not just in the bass, it's up to the lower mids, and then you've got the high mids as well with a little bit of boost, helping give a little bit of clarity. Here's a speaker I really like. Xtreme 2, never been a go-to for me. And I think if you're spending £200, if it's about having quite a big sound without the greatest sound, maybe the XB43 for you. Oh, you know, you're going to the beach. Maybe that's, you know, where you want that pump, pump, pump sound coming through. Maybe that's for you. Anyway, I hope I put enough into my video that you got the answer to what you may be asking yourself. And just showing you the Dockin D Fine does hold its own with these speakers, especially when you go to maximum volume. So, hope you got something out of my video, and I thank you for watching.